So when someone experiences a catastrophic physical injury, say like third-degree burns over a large portion of their body, our immediate collective reaction is just profound empathy.
Right, absolutely.
We intuitively understand that even, a gentle breeze or a slight shift in temperature is going to cause them excruciating pain.
Yeah, we definitely don't judge them for flinching.
Exactly. And we don't call them difficult when they cry out. But when you pivot to the landscape of mental health and specifically to personality disorders, that fundamental empathy it often just vanishes.
It really does,
We
yeah.
see the flinching, we see the defensive reactions, and instead of recognizing a profound injury, society just slaps on a label. We call it a character flaw.
Which really represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the actual underlying mechanics at play. I mean, we are essentially judging a neurological and psychological burn unit as if it were simply, a series of bad behavioral choices.
Which brings us to today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. For you, the learner listening right now, our mission today is to entirely reframe how we look at one of the most stigmatized conditions in modern psychiatry.
Borderline personality disorder, or BPD.
Right. We are going to cut through all the sensationalized media portrayals to understand exactly what is happening under the hood, like how these symptoms actually manifest both outwardly and inwardly.
And why diagnosing this condition has historically been an absolute nightmare for clinicians.
To do that effectively, we're pulling from a pretty rigorous stack of sources.
Yeah, that includes the evolving diagnostic frameworks in the DSM-5, the new dimensional models in the ICD-11, and some highly targeted clinical research.
Like those studies utilizing the childhood trauma questionnaire, right?
Exactly, along with comprehensive psychological texts like The Essential Family Guide to Borderline Personality Disorder.
Okay, let's unpack this. Setting aside the cultural noise for a second, I really want to ground this in sheer scale.
Yeah.
Because there's this huge assumption that BPD is a fringe diagnosis, like something incredibly rare.
Right, but the clinical data severely undercuts that assumption. Current estimates actually indicate that borderline personality disorder affects roughly 1 to 6% of the general population.
Wait, 1 to 6%?
Yeah.
To put that into perspective, for anyone doing the math, that means BPD is significantly more prevalent than schizophrenia.
Oh, absolutely.
And it even outpaces the diagnosis rates for autism spectrum disorder. I mean, it is ubiquitous.
It is. We are talking about up to 20% of all psychiatric outpatients, and a quarter of all inpatients actually carry this specific diagnosis.
Wow. Yet, despite being everywhere, the defining characteristic of BPD seems to be this pervasive, relentless instability that just fractures a person's baseline functioning.
Yeah, and that instability attacks 3 core pillars of the human experience. It hits interpersonal relationships, self-image, and effective or, emotional regulation.
And for an audience already familiar with psychological frameworks, the concept of splitting is heavily associated with BPD, right?
It is, yeah. But looking past the basic definition of that dichotomous black and white thinking, the actual mechanics of a split are deeply neurological.
So it's not a choice.
No, not at all. This isn't a conscious choice to suddenly hate someone. Under the threat of perceived rejection, the brain's amygdala essentially hijacks the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah. Okay.
So the cognitive nuance required to hold 2 opposing truths about a person, like that they're a good person who just made a bad mistake, that nuance just evaporates.
The individual is basically elevated to a flawless, idealized pedestal, and the second that illusion cracks, the whole structural framework of the relationship collapses.
Precisely. And that total emotional whiplash doesn't just apply to other people either. The literature highlights a profound structural sense of emptiness.
Right, it isn't just depression or passing sadness. It is an enduring lack of identity. Emily Mendez, whose work heavily informs our understanding here, uses a phrase that completely reframed the condition for me.
Oh, the emotional skin analogy.
Yeah, she describes living with BPD as having no emotional skin.
What's fascinating here is how brilliantly that metaphor captures the hypersensitivity of the disorder.
Right, because everything feels like sandpaper.
Exactly. A micro-expression, a slight shift in a partner's tone of voice, or a delayed text message. Stimuli that a neurotypical brain would just filter out as background noise.
But for them, it registers as agonizing friction.
Yes. Every interpersonal interaction carries the potential for catastrophic pain.
And what's wild about that raw, skinless state is how it alters social cognition, particularly empathy. because there's this common misconception that individuals with BPD lack empathy entirely.
Which is so damaging.
Yeah, it leads to these dangerous conflations with other conditions.
Right. The conflation with narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, is rampant but completely clinically inaccurate.
How so? Like, what's the core difference?
Well, with NPD, the empathy deficit is largely structural. It's cold and unremitting. The individual consistently struggles to conceptualize or even care about the internal state of others.
But in BPD, it's different.
Radically different. In borderline personality disorder, the lack of empathy is entirely stress-induced and temporary.
Okay, so it's situational.
Exactly. When that emotional skin is scraped, say, by a perceived threat of abandonment, the patient experiences a highly reactive decline in cognitive empathy.
Because the sheer volume of their own internal panic just overrides their ability to process another person's perspective.
They are essentially drowning in their own emotional floodwaters. It becomes biologically impossible to toss a life preserver to anyone else in that moment.
But the second the perceived threat passes and the nervous system downregulates, all that empathy floods back in, right?
Yes, and usually accompanied by crippling guilt. And unlike NPD, people with BPD possess an immense capacity for intense positive emotion.
They can be fiercely loyal,
Fiercely loyal and profoundly caring, provided the environment feels perfectly secure.
which creates just an exhausting pendulum swing for the patient. Because they inhabit an internal world defined by these emotional extremes, those dynamics inevitably spill outward.
They do. It turns their external relationships into highly volatile battlefields. And clinical observation generally categorizes these interpersonal struggles into two distinct behavioral patterns.
Right, the first being the butterfly-like pattern. In this manifestation, the individual rapidly flutters in and out of transient relationships.
They cycle through friendships and romantic partners at breakneck speed.
The logic here seems almost anticipatory, right? Like if you never fully attach, or if you abandon the other person first, you preemptively neutralize the threat of being abandoned yourself.
Exactly. You maintain control of the rejection.
And the alternative is the attached pattern.
Yes. Here, the individual maintains far fewer relationships, but the bonds are overwhelmingly intense, intertwined, and highly dependent.
The boundary between where the patient's identity ends and the partner's identity begins essentially dissolves.
And when that enmeshment occurs, the collateral damage of the mood swings expands significantly. It affects not just the chosen individuals.
The romantic partners or friends who, opted into the dynamic.
Right. It heavily impacts the unchosen individuals, too.
The unchosen being siblings, parents, children, and in-laws. People who find themselves living in the blast radius of this emotional dysregulation simply by virtue of genetics or circumstance.
And the outward behavioral symptoms used to cope with this pain are incredibly severe.
Yeah. To regulate those intolerable emotional spikes, patients often resort to high-risk impulsivity. We're talking reckless driving, severe substance abuse, binge eating.
Extreme financial recklessness, too. But the most devastating consequence highlighted in the clinical data is the sheer lethality of the disorder.
The mortality and self-harm statistics are just staggering.
They really are. Nearly 84% of patients diagnosed with BPD will engage in suicidal behaviors or non-suicidal self-injury,
And roughly 70% will make at least one active suicide attempt in their lifetime,
with the clinical average actually sitting at 3.4 attempts per individual.
which is heartbreaking. And tragically, up to 10% of individuals with BPD will ultimately die by suicide.
Those numbers demand a total reevaluation of how society treats these patients.
Which brings me to a massive point of tension in the psychological literature. Because of these outward behaviors, the frantic, sometimes aggressive efforts to avoid abandonment, the self-harm people with BPD are routinely labeled by society as manipulative.
Yeah, and shockingly often by medical professionals as well.
Yeah. I really want to challenge this label. Are they actually engaging in calculated manipulation, or is the medical community just grossly misinterpreting a survival mechanism?
Well, the Harvard Review of Psychiatry addresses this exact stigma. The label of manipulation implies a cold, premeditated calculus.
Like they're playing chess.
Right. It implies the patient is thinking, if I threaten self-harm, I will successfully control my partner's behavior. But the clinical reality is that these behaviors are frantic, maladaptive attempts to discharge intolerable psychological agony.
It is a panic response, not a chess move.
Exactly. But because it looks like a chess move to the person on the receiving end, it creates a horrific self-fulfilling prophecy.
A completely devastating cycle. The clinician, or the partner, or the parent feels manipulated.
And their natural human response to feeling controlled is to establish boundaries by withdrawing, either physically or emotional.
And emotional withdrawal is the exact trigger the person with BPD is already reacting to.
Right. By stepping back, the clinician actually validates the patient's absolute worst fear, that they are inherently unlovable and are actively being abandoned.
So the patient's distress exponentially escalates, resulting in even more extreme behavior.
Which only solidifies the clinician's false belief that the patient is just being difficult. It is a systemic failure of empathy rooted in misunderstanding the symptom as a character flaw.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If that explosive, externalized cycle is the classic presentation of BPD, how do we account for the patients whose internal experience is identical, but their external presentation is completely inverted?
You're talking about when a brain is wired to generate that exact same emotional hurricane, but it points all of that destructive energy inward. You are looking at a presentation commonly referred to in the psychological community as quiet BPD.
Right. Psychologist Theodore Millon famously proposed this as the discouraged subtype. The operating principle here flips from acting out to acting in.
Which is a profound shift.
My mental image for quiet BPD is a duck gliding across a very still pond. From the shoreline, everything looks serene, polite, and perfectly put together.
But beneath the surface of the water,
The duck is paddling frantically, just expending a massive amount of energy just to keep from drowning in a current of rejection and fear.
that analogy perfectly captures the sheer cognitive load required to maintain the facade. In quiet BPD, the hyperreactivity, the terror of abandonment, and the severe mood swings are absolutely present.
But instead of discharging that energy outward through rage or frantic clinging, they suppress it.
They view their own intense emotions as a burden to others, so they swallow their anger to avoid any potential confrontation.
So when a perceived rejection occurs, instead of lashing out at the partner, they completely withdraw. They isolate themselves.
The splitting mechanism still happens, but the target changes. During a conflict, instead of devaluing the other person as entirely bad, they devalue themselves.
They internalize the blame for every micro-shift in the relationship.
It traps them in a relentless echo chamber of guilt, shame, and silent self-criticism. They are constantly analyzing their own behavior to figure out why they are supposedly so broken.
Which makes this manifestation incredibly dangerous from a clinical perspective, especially since quiet BPD is not recognized as an official, distinct diagnosis in the DSM-5.
Right. You cannot walk out of a psychiatrist's office with a piece of paper that says quiet BPD. It is simply a framework utilized by specialists to understand this specific internalized architecture.
Because the outward explosions are missing, the risk of misdiagnosis just skyrockets, doesn't it?
Oh, massively. A patient presents to a clinician exhibiting severe withdrawal, emotional exhaustion, and intense self-blame.
The doctor doesn't see the classic BPD rage, so they slap a label of major depressive disorder or social anxiety disorder on the chart.
And they prescribe an SSRI, but treating the depression might alleviate some of the lethargy, but it does absolutely nothing to address the core personality architecture.
Right, the splitting or the underlying fear of abandonment is still there.
Exactly. Furthermore, the self-harm in quiet BPD is often highly concealed, meaning these patients suffer in total isolation until a crisis point is reached.
So if the outward symptoms of classic BPD and the inward symptoms of quiet BPD look completely fundamentally different on the surface, how on earth is a doctor supposed to know what they're actually looking at?
It's a huge challenge.
The diagnostic history of this condition feels less like a science and more like a guessing game. Even the word borderline feels remarkably imprecise.
Well, the etymology is incredibly dated. The term originated in the mid-20th century, specifically the 1930s to 1960s.
Back when psychoanalysis broadly bifurcated patients into two massive categories, right?
Yes. Neurosis, where patients maintained a grip on reality but suffered anxiety or depression. And psychosis, where patients lost touch with reality entirely.
So clinicians observed a unique subset of patients who, under extreme stress, seemed to teeter right on the border between these two states.
Hence, they were on the borderline. Even though modern neuroscience knows that framework is completely obsolete, the name just embedded itself in the lexicon.
And for nearly a century, BPD essentially functioned as psychiatry's wastebasket diagnosis, didn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. If a patient presented with complex trauma didn't respond well to standard treatments and just defied neat categorization, Clinicians just toss their file into the borderline wastebasket.
It wasn't even formalized into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual until the DSM-3 was published in 1980.
Right. And today, under the current DSM-5, the diagnosis relies on a categorical checklist.
Okay, let's look at that checklist.
There are 9 core symptoms, ranging from chronic emptiness to stress-related paranoia to impulsive behavior. To meet the threshold for a BPD diagnosis, a patient must actively demonstrate at least 5 of those 9 criteria.
And clinicians use tools like the Structured Clinical Interview for Personality Disorders,
Yeah.
or SCID-5PD,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. Or questionnaires like the MHI-5 to evaluate these specific metrics.
Wait, I mean, I have to challenge this categorical model for a second because the math immediately exposes a massive flaw.
Go ahead.
If the manual requires any 5 out of 9 symptoms to secure the diagnosis, you could have patient A who exhibits frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, intense anger, impulsivity, self-harm, and unstable relationships.
Okay, yes.
Then you have patient B who exhibits chronic emptiness, paranoia, identity disturbance, mood swings, and just one of the symptoms from patient A's list.
Right.
They could overlap on a single trait, present entirely different clinical profiles, and
Yeah.
yet both receive the exact same borderline label. How is that a reliable diagnosis?
This raises an important question, and you've actually just articulated the concept of phenotypic heterogeneity.
Phenotypic heterogeneity. Okay.
And it is the exact reason modern psychiatry is heavily criticizing the DSM-5's approach. When a diagnostic label covers over 250 possible symptom combinations, the label itself loses its clinical utility.
Because it doesn't tell the treating physician what the patient actually needs.
Exactly. The DSM-5 essentially treats personality disorders like a light switch. You either have 5 symptoms and the BPD switch is flipped on, or you only have 4 and the switch is OFF.
But human neurology doesn't work in binary switches. It works in degrees.
Which is why the shift toward the new ICD-11 dimensional model feels like a massive upgrade.
Right, rather than a light switch, the ICD-11 treats personality traits more like an audio mixing board in a recording studio.
The audio mixing board analogy is brilliant. Instead of asking, does this patient cross an arbitrary threshold, the dimensional model examines the specific sliders on that board.
So it evaluates the severity of pathological personality traits.
Yes, and how intensely those traits impair a patient's daily functioning.
So for a patient dealing with BPD, the clinician isn't just checking a box, they're looking at the slider for negative affectivity.
Which measures the sheer volume and frequency of emotional instability and negative emotions.
And they are also looking at the slider for disinhibition, which captures the severity of their impulsivity and reckless behavior.
By analyzing where those specific sliders are set, the clinician receives a highly nuanced, individualized map of the patient's actual psychological struggles, rather than a generic categorical stamp.
So knowing how devastating these symptoms are and how wildly they vary from patient to patient, we have to look at the genesis of the disorder. Like, how do the sliders on a developing human brain get pushed to the absolute maximum in the first place?
The preeminent psychological framework for understanding this genesis is the biosocial theory, initially developed by Dr. Marsha Linehan.
Okay, what does that theory posit?
It posits that BPD is born from a catastrophic collision between 2 distinct forces. The first force is a biological vulnerability.
Meaning some individuals are simply born with a heightened neurological baseline for emotional responsivity.
Yes, their limbic system reacts faster to stimuli, the emotional peak is much higher, and it takes their nervous system significantly longer to return to baseline.
They are born with the emotional skin already a bit thinner than average.
Exactly. But biology alone doesn't trigger a personality disorder. It requires the second force, a social environment that chronically invalidates that emotional expression.
So you take a highly sensitive, emotionally reactive child and place them in an environment that constantly punishes them for their feelings.
Or tells them they are overreacting, or outright neglects their emotional reality.
The genetic component of that biological vulnerability is undeniable, though. The literature indicates that an individual is roughly 5 times more likely to develop BPD if a first-degree relative like a parent or sibling has the diagnosis.
Yeah, the overall heritability of the disorder is estimated to sit between 40 and 46%.
But the environmental piece, the trauma, is where the architecture of the brain actually warps. The sources pointed to a deeply compelling study out of Poland that utilized the Childhood Trauma Questionnaire, or CTQ.
Yes, the researchers wanted to compare the trauma profiles of patients with BPD against patients with bipolar disorder.
Right, because both groups suffer from debilitating mood swings. But the origins of those swings are fundamentally different.
Bipolar is notoriously heavily genetic, with heritability sometimes pushing 80%.
But what did the trauma data actually reveal about the borderline patients? What were the specific findings?
Well, the Polish study definitively illustrated the environmental bedrock of BPD. While trauma can certainly trigger or exacerbate bipolar episodes, the patients diagnosed with BPD scored significantly and universally higher across every single metric of childhood trauma measured by the CTQ.
We aren't just talking about a vague sense of a bad childhood.
No, we are talking about statistically massive increases in emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, and physical neglect.
That's horrifying.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it proves that BPD is inextricably rooted in severe environmental stress during the developmental years.
And the crucial insight here is that trauma of that magnitude doesn't just hurt a child's feelings, it acts as a physical force on a developing nervous system.
It does. Chronic adverse childhood experiences flood the brain with cortisol and stress-related neuropeptides.
And this chemical flood actively alters how the brain wires itself. The amygdala becomes hyperreactive because it constantly needs to scan for danger, right?
Yes, and the prefrontal cortex struggles to build the neural pathways required for emotional regulation because the environment never modeled safety.
So the splitting, the hypervigilance, the frantic avoidance of abandonment, these are not character flaws.
Not at all. They are highly adaptive survival mechanisms. The brain intentionally wired itself this way to survive an abusive, invalidating childhood.
It is a brilliant biological adaptation to a horrific environment.
Which unfortunately becomes highly maladaptive once the individual escapes that environment and tries to function in the adult world.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, listening to this deep dive? It means that when you consider the statistic that roughly 1 in 100 people in the general population navigates life with BPD, you realize you almost certainly know someone fighting this invisible battle.
You do.
And understanding the mechanics underneath, like the frantic underwater paddling of quiet BPD, the stress-induced collapse of cognitive empathy, and the profound developmental trauma that physically altered their brain's architecture. It demands an immediate shift in our collective perspective.
It absolutely demands that we permanently retire the pejorative labels of manipulative, toxic, or attention-seeking.
We have to replace judgment with profound empathy. People with borderline personality disorder are not the exotic, dangerous caricatures sensationalized by movies and pop culture.
They aren't.
They're human beings walking through a chaotic world without emotional skin, reacting to daily interactions that feel like sandpaper.
And yet, embedded in the very biology of this disorder is an immense reason for hope. Because I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, drawn from the neurological reality of how those trauma pathways were built.
Okay, let's hear it.
The foundational rule of neuroplasticity is that the location of the brain's emotional wires isn't permanent.
Right, the brain is not a static bone that sets in place forever.
Precisely. If a highly invalidating, traumatizing environment possesses the power to physically wire a developing brain to experience the relentless emotional dysregulation of BPD, could a radically validating, highly supportive environment achieved through rigorous, targeted interventions like dialectical behavior therapy literally rewrite the physical structure of a person's personality over time?
That is a staggering question to leave on. If the brain can wire itself for survival, it holds the blueprint to rewire itself for connection.
Yes, it might require immense time, rigorous therapy, and an environment of radical empathy, but the damage is not an immovable life sentence.
The capacity to heal is already built into the system.